on economic development. My name is Ian Flatt. I'm an economic development analyst at Camoin Associates. So just to go over a little bit of webinar housekeeping. At this point, everyone is muted to limit the amount of background noise. You can ask questions using the chat function on the right-hand side of your screen. We will respond to some questions during the webinar and hold other ones till the end, depending on what we think is best. But just to get started, if everyone could just take a moment and practice using the question pane. Again, that's on the right side of your screen. Just introduce yourself, tell us where you're from, what field you work in, and that would really help us just to get to know our audience a little bit better. This presentation will be available on the Camoin Associates blog after the webinar. The recording will also be uploaded to YouTube, and the slides will be available on our blog as well as on SlideShare. This is the third in a four-part series of webinars sponsored by Camoin Associates on the trends in the field of workforce development and how economic development and workforce development can collaborate to better support businesses and individuals. Information about the first two webinars and the fourth and final upcoming webinar can be found on the Camoin Associates blog, links to which will be provided at the end of the webinar. So again, the topic of today's webinar is the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act and its impact on economic development. And again, if you could all just take a moment to quickly introduce yourself, just let us know your name, where you're from, and what field you work in. And that would just help us get to know our audience a little bit better and get you familiar with using the question function. Again, use the question function to ask any questions you might have during the presentation or at the end, and we'll make sure that Colleen gets around to as many as possible. So just to provide a little bit of background on the speaker for today's presentation, our presenter is Colleen LaRose. She's a workforce development specialist at Camoin Associates and the founder and CEO of the Northeast Regional Employment and Training Association. Colleen is a highly regarded workforce development expert and a champion of getting workforce development and economic development to collaborate. She has over 20 years of experience in workforce development public policy and has been featured as a speaker at both workforce and economic development conferences across the country, including the International Economic Development Council, the Northeastern Economic Development Association, and the National Association of Workforce Development Professionals. In 2012, Colleen founded the Northeast Regional Employment and Training Association, also known as NERETA, which has been essential to providing training to economic development and workforce organizations and opening the lines of communication between these groups. Colleen is also the workforce development specialist at Camoin Associates, using her experience and insight to assist our economic development and workforce clients. Thank you all again for joining us. And just, if you could again, just take a moment, practice using the question function by introducing yourself, let us know where you're from and what field you work in. And at this point, I'm just going to go ahead and pass the presentation over to Colleen.
Hello. Can everybody hear me okay? Ian, can you hear me? Good.
Yes,
okay. I want to make sure that I can be heard. Okay. So good afternoon or morning, according to which part of the country that you're calling in from. We are really thrilled to have you joining us today. We've done a couple of webinars now leading up really to this one, which is what I'm very excited to present to you. Not that I wasn't excited about the others, they were important, but they sort of just laid the groundwork for where it is that we want to go as a country with regard to our workforce development initiatives. The first webinar that we did was on the disconnect between education and workforce development, understanding why education does not take the role of training workers for companies across the country. It's interesting, we just had we did an interview yesterday with a college, and they were talking about the very topic, the disconnect between what it is that they're producing, which is, it was a liberal arts academic kind of college, and that they are very clear that they're producing, you know, people with degrees and, you know, broad thinking and what employers are saying that they need is very different from what the colleges are producing. So it is, it's an interesting conversation. It's a conversation that needs to go on in more depth than what we have held it in the past, and we really need to get clear on aligning our goals so that we are all talking the same language and understanding what each of our roles are so that we can move this whole thing forward. The second webinar that we did was about the history of workforce development, where this has come from, why it was needed. In part, you can understand from what I just said about education and workforce development not aligning. Well, you can imagine that education and economic development do not align then. And workforce development sort of plays a bit of the liaison role between those two entities in helping to align goals of the region that they're in. And so that second webinar discussed the history of workforce development, but also the current role that workforce development has taken. And now today, we're ready to move forward and talk about the new legislation that was signed into law on July 22nd of 2014. It was only about 15 years late. I say that jokingly. The WIA, Workforce Investment Act, came into law in 1998, and after the first 5 years, we all did strategic plans and talked about, where we need to go with that. It was supposed to be reauthorized at that time, and it kept getting kind of pushed to the back, and it finally, instead of just reauthorizing WIA, finally in 2014, they said, you know what, this is so old now, and we really understand what so many of the problems are with this legislation, and we're now going to just write new legislation to replace that old legislation, building on, of course, what we've already learned. So we're going to talk today about what we learned through the Workforce Investment Act, which I'm going to refer to as WIA, and we're going to talk about this new legislation and what that's going to do for us, how it's going to empower us to move forward and progress, as well as how it's kind of challenging us to raise the bar, to do more. And, I'm excited to see not only where this goes, but, what is the potential for us, even, going well into the future. What's the next legislation going to look like? I'm already thinking about that. So, okay, next slide, Ian. Okay, so real briefly, very briefly, I'm going to do a little bit of a review of those first two webinars just so that we have the groundwork laid for those who may have missed those webinars. We would, highly recommend that you go on YouTube on Camoin Associates, and you can see those webinars from there, or you can go to the Camoin Associates blog on their website and get connected to the webinars there, all free of charge. And also the email that we've sent out to you inviting you to these webinars have links to those past webinars. So if you have any trouble at all, just reach out to us, because we'd really like you to see those first two webinars. But that being said, what is workforce development is an important understanding before we move forward in talking about this. And you can see that, I have a Wikipedia, and I've got a Federal Reserve of St. Louis definition, and, if you look it up, what is workforce development, if you Google that, you're going to find probably 100 or more definitions. I kind of like to really simplify things and say, workforce development is really just the government system that helps put people to work. And in a nutshell, that kind of works. There's a lot more to be said about that. And just very briefly, what I do want to say is an organization can do workforce development and not be a partner necessarily in the workforce development system. When I refer to workforce development, I'm talking about the noun, workforce development, that is the system that's been put together of partners that are working on workforce development issues together, but that's not to negate the important work that's being done by organizations that are part of the verb, if you will, the action point, that are doing workforce development but may not be active partners in the public system. Okay, next slide. So again, talking about the last webinars we did, if you were on those, you will recall this slide from the first webinar about the difference between education and workforce development. And clearly, the purpose of education is very, very different than what the purpose of workforce development is. The purpose of education is very broad understanding of the world, helping people to appreciate learning for the sake of learning, helping them to appreciate their own culture, to appreciate conforming to societal rules, being able to participate in the society in the way voting and being able to pay your bills and even to be able to bring out individual skills and particular talents that someone might have. It does play a little bit of an economic role in the basic survival skills of reading, writing, and arithmetic, but it really is not so much about economic success as it is about appreciating learning and being a generally what we call an educated person. The purpose of workforce development, therefore, is very, very different because it is all about the economic survival of people. Because once you're educated, that's wonderful, but if you can't survive in the society, if you haven't developed a skill that you can sell in the marketplace, then you are kind of left adrift. And it's very important that people understand that there are kind of the rules of society with regard to being able to have workplace readiness skills, showing up to work on time, being able to work in a team, understanding the language that you're working in, having supports provided to you if, for instance, in transportation or childcare or some of those things that may be barriers to helping you to get into an employment situation. So workforce development takes on the role of helping people to find the skills that they need in order to be marketable and to overcome the barriers that they may have in becoming employed. It's entirely an economic purpose as opposed to education. So next slide. Again, this was, we did an entire webinar about this last month, so I'm not going to spend too much time, but this is sort of in very brief the background of where did workforce development come from, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because you have an entire webinar that you can take a look at to learn more about this. As I said, today we're really going to talk about what the challenges were under the Workforce Investment Act that was enacted in 1998 under President Clinton, and we're also going to talk about moving forward with this new legislation that has been enacted under President Obama. Okay, next slide. So the major, again, if you go back to that history of workforce development, you'll see that each one of those programs had its own set of challenges. And, we as a society learn as we go. We have ideas about what will work and we try them out. And sometimes they're good ideas and sometimes they need to be tweaked and sometimes they need to be thrown out completely and, kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater and start over. In this case, the Workforce Investment Act legislation was really good legislation. It truly was. It was ahead of its time for the time that it was written, and it was very progressive, and it had a lot of problems. And we learned what those problems were as we were moving through it. Part of the problem is that we had big ideas, but we didn't have the money to back them up. And so, the peak of the funding for these kinds of programs was in 1979, and it's dropped by some 70%, up until now. That's a huge drop in funding, obviously. Now, those are in real dollars, so that's pretty significant. So we need to think in terms of if we're going to if we're going to say that something has to happen, we have to have the money to back it up. And the Workforce Investment Act, I remember many colleagues talking about it as being a famously unfunded mandate. That you have to do this, but we're not going to give you any money to get it done. And so that was a huge problem with the Workforce Investment Act. Also, under the Workforce Investment Act, there was an emphasis on getting people into the workforce. That was really the major premise of the legislation was we got to get them jobs, get them jobs, get them jobs. And that was a really progressive thought at the time. And we said, at the most important, we're going to do everything we can to get them employed, and then we'll worry about training them once they get employed. Either the employers will train them, or we can, think about tuition reimbursement where they can go back to school. The employer will help them pay for, college or something so that they can go back to school. Well, the idea was great. The problem is that in practice, what happened is people didn't go back to school. And employers weren't training people. In fact, training dropped off dramatically. And people, what happened is we wound up at a time in our history, the history of humanity, when we had all of this technology that was dumped upon us, and we all had to kind of come up to speed very, very quickly. We were at a time when we were not training people in the United States. And so that is really when the United States began to drop in its stature with regard to education and the quality of our workforce, et cetera. Globally, we began to drop like a stone because we weren't investing in training. We were trying to get everybody to go to work first. And so we learned from that that probably was a mistake. Hindsight is 20/20. That probably was not the right way to go, but it sounded good when the legislation was enacted. And so there were not as many, again, because the emphasis was not on training, there was less opportunity to train people who might be low skilled, low income, or youth, because again, the emphasis was all on get people into the jobs. Okay, next slide. So there were a lot of other problems with the Workforce Investment Act. And again, we went through these in quite a bit of detail in the last webinar, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but it's important for you to understand that one of the major problems was that we were not coordinating workforce initiatives with economic development. And you'll see that I posted that as number one, and that was a major problem and something that we're going to talk about quite a bit in this in this webinar going forward. We were in silos of service where the economic development was kind of doing their thing, workforce development was doing their thing. We may have sat on each other's boards, but we really were not doing mutual goal setting. We were not really actively engaging employers together as a team. We were not doing things, frankly, smart. Right? I mean, working together, working collaboratively is frankly working smarter. And we just we don't have enough money to not work smart anymore. We have got to utilize the limited resources that we have, and we've got to work smarter using those limited resources. So again, if you want to go through the entire list of this, I recommend going back to the last webinar that we did, but we're going to move forward. But just understand that that's really doing that economic development and workforce development, collaborative work to get, working together is going to help align the strategies and help them to work more closely together. And then you'll see in the new legislation that that is addressed. Okay, next slide. So, okay, next slide. So one of the things, there are a number of different things that the new legislation is going to bring forward to us. Some of them will be more important to people who work in workforce development. I'm going to mention them just kind of on an aside so that people in economic development understand that there's more to this legislation than just workforce development should work more closely with economic development. Workforce development really has a lot on their plate now, and they're being really challenged to raise the bar in a number of different areas. And one of those is formerly under Workforce Investment Act, there were 3 programs. One was adults, and that was for people who are, you know, adult job seekers who are lower income. People who are dislocated workers, that is that they've lost their job, whether the company closed and moved or whatever it is that happened, they're out of work, and also youth programs. Those were the 3 major programs under the Workforce Investment Act where the funds actually came to the workforce investment boards, and they were able to create programs around those 3 populations. But there were other populations that were funded under other entities, under the Department of Education, under the Department of Labor, and under the programs that were under the Workforce Investment Act, where the WIBs, that's Workforce Investment Boards, got the money directly, they had parameters, benchmarks that they had to reach. So it was closely monitored, and they had performance measures that they had to attend to with each of those programs. So they were that money was very closely guarded, and there, you know, as I said, there were these performance measures attached to that money. The other programs under the Department of Education and the Department of Labor did not have performance measures attached to them, and it caused, I would say, a little bit of strife. In that, you know, the Workforce Investment Act money was looked at as, you know, so strictly, and yet these other programs were kind of going on the way that they always had under, you know, the old programs, CETA, JTPA, those kinds of programs. And so under this new legislation, all of these programs now are going to have performance measures attached to them. And they're also going to have to co-locate, they're going to have to share their resources, they're going to have to integrate how they take people in to their program and how they report on what the outcomes of these individuals are. This is really progressive, and it's going to be hard, you know, I mean, because they all have different masters. They all answer to different people, but they're all going to have to answer on the same questions. So how this is going to play out is going to be fascinating. The rules and regulations for the new legislation called the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act were supposed to come out on January 18th. It's complicated, and it's been delayed. And we're hoping that those rules and regulations will come out soon. But the Department of Labor purposely slowed down on those rules and regulations so that they can get it right, because this is not going to be easy. So that's one of the issues that these local workforce investment boards are going to be dealing with. Okay, next slide. So as part of that, because there are these new performance measures, there's going to be more transparency, more accountability, and what's interesting is that this does not only apply to those programs that are part of this new, you know, integrated system, for instance, the vocational rehabilitation, et cetera. It also applies to anyone who is getting training dollars. So those in the workforce system understand that as the eligible provider training list, right? And those are people who can provide training services and receive these public dollars to help people to get that training that they might need in order to find employment. Those training partners, so these might be colleges, they might be vocational schools, they might be private training providers, are all going to have higher levels of reporting outcomes and higher levels of accountability with regard to how successful the people that they train are when they get into the workforce. Did it improve their income? Did it, you know, provide them with a job, maybe they, you know, a better job? You know, there are going to be a number of different parameters that are going to be looked at with regard to that. Okay, next slide. What's really kind of neat about this legislation, what I love about it, truly, is that it looks at what all of the wonderful best practices have been across the country. There are always some people who do something really, really great, and you know, that other areas need to learn from. And it's wonderful to have a pocket of success. It's better if that pocket of success is then duplicated across the country. And so what this legislation has done is look at, well, what is working? What makes a region more successful based on the kinds of investments that they're making in the workforce in that region? And these are some of the ideas that are working really well across the country. And again, some areas are good at, like some areas might be fantastic at work-based learning programs. Other areas might be fantastic at incumbent worker programs. Other areas might be great at sector-based strategies. But the new legislation is saying, you know what, we want you all to do all of these. So there's another challenge. That's big. This is taking on all of the best practices and saying, you know what, we think that you all should be doing all of this. So again, another huge challenge for workforce investment boards who may have adopted one or two of these strategies, may not have been doing any of these strategies, and now are under the gun to kind of do all of these strategies. Okay, next slide. Another important part of this legislation is that it's going to require proper planning. And when I say that, what I mean is it specifically lays out that they want strategic plans to have specific planning elements. I don't know how many of you have had the opportunity to read strategic plans from across the country, but I have taken it upon myself to read strategic plans from many, many, many states across the country, both in workforce development and in economic development. And I have to tell you that we really need to do a better job, and this is not saying anything derogatory about the people who are running those programs, because most of them that I've ever met are fantastic at running the operations and making sure that everything's getting done, and they're juggling a number of different balls, and they're doing a great job at all of it. But they may not be the world's best strategic planning people, and strategic planning is a skill that can be taught. And it is something that Camoin Associates actually is taking on to assist regions when they ask for it or need it in how to do strategic planning. Because strategic planning is, as I said, it's a skill, and it is something that should be based in data. It is something that should be based in research. It should be something that's based in surveying. It should be something that's based in an understanding of not just the local area, but the regional area, the entire state that they're working in, the direction of the country, the global impacts of what it is that they're doing. There's a lot to planning, and frankly, to do it right, having been a workforce investment board director, I don't think that you can, I challenge whether a workforce investment board director has the time, frankly, to do all of that themselves. It's almost something that you almost have to hire a consultant to help you to get all of that done and to do it right. But the legislation is very clear that they don't want just kind of half-hearted attempts at strategic planning anymore. They want strategic plans that are done properly and at the state level. The strategic plans at the state level, the state workforce investment boards, previously were, it's a good idea if you do one and send it to the Department of Labor, the U.S. Department of Labor. Now it's going to be required. So that's an important new step that all state workforce investment boards are going to have to do these state workforce investment board strategic plans, and of course they should be aligning those, the local WIBs should be aligning with their state workforce investment board's plan. Okay, next slide. So here we go with workforce development and economic development collaboration. And, as I said to you from the beginning, this is kind of, what I've been championing for several years now, actually. In fact, with the Northeast Regional Employment and Training Association, one of the things that we did was an initiative called economic developers, take your workforce investment board director to lunch day, and it's supposed to be the first Friday of the month of June is when we set this. Not for any particular reason, it just seemed at the time to be a good time to do it. And when I started that, people thought I was completely nuts. Like, you know, why should they have to sit down and have lunch together? Why should they have to talk? And then, you know, come a few years later, here comes the legislation saying workforce development and economic development really need to be setting goals together and doing joint research and sharing their data and doing collaborative grant applications and working on SEDS planning together. Now, if you're not familiar with SEDS planning, this is something that economic developers know about, but very few workforce investment boards know about. This is money from the Economic Development Administration under the Department of Commerce, and it's called the Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy Plans, and they actually give you money to do planning in your region. Now, this is highly unusual in the world of workforce investment boards. We don't normally get money for planning. We usually get money for action, for you know, specific work that we're doing, programs that we're setting up, those kinds of things, but very seldom do we get money for just planning. And so this is fantastic pot of money, and they were supposed to invite workforce investment boards to the table when this planning is being done. But way too often it was lip service in these plans and not necessarily something that was actively, where they were actively engaging workforce investment boards. Often, and if you talk to economic developers, you know, listen, I'm not dissing anybody here. Workforce development was seen as a social services agency that was providing service to indigent people who couldn't find jobs. That was the view of what workforce development was. And, you know, I think in fairness, we should own the fact that that is very much what we were. But the new legislation is saying we don't want you to be that anymore. You know, you need to be that, but you also need to be out front leading the planning initiatives for your region, working on what the strategic goals are of your region, doing this joint research, sharing your data, et cetera, et cetera. So these SEDS plans, the reason I bring this up now, are requiring, or going to be requiring, workforce investment boards to be at the table in a very active role. And we're going to talk about that more in the next webinar, but I wanted to make sure that I brought that to light here. So next slide. So, you know, obviously economic development and workforce development have something in common, and it's not job seekers. Although job seekers are really important, that's not what economic development and workforce development have in common. What they have in common are employers. And anybody in workforce development understands and knows that under the Workforce Investment Act, we were required to attend to two customers. One was job seekers and the other was employers. Now, one got attended to and the other not as much. And I'll tell you why I think that happened, and that is because the performance measures were related to job seekers. There were no performance measures related to engaging with employers. There will be now, and that's going to, I think, make all of the difference. So, you know, it's not going to be just, you know, for instance, with the performance measures of job seekers, it was, you know, did they improve their salary? Did they retain the job? Those kinds of things. You know, with the employer emphasis now, there are going to be benchmarks there yet to be determined. These will come out under the rules and regulations that we talked about earlier that aren't out yet. But it's important to understand that we will be held accountable. We, the workforce development system, will be held accountable for performance measures related to employers. And we're not going to be ready for that or capable of that unless we work actively with our economic development partners, because frankly we've got our plates full already serving job seekers. So, you know, this is almost taking on an entirely new entity, and it would be very challenging, if not impossible, if we don't partner and collaborate on this effort. Okay, next slide. So, you know, the point is that we need to make these workforce investment boards have to become more accountable for producing positive employment and earning outcomes, but that's as much a part of working with the job seekers and their skills as it is with the employers, and helping employers to become partners in growing their businesses in the region so that they are hiring more people, so that they have career pathways, so that people can move up career ladders, etc. Okay, next slide. And so when we look at this, okay, what are the things that economic development and workforce development can work on together? And, you know, we talked about this a little bit in a couple slides ago, but, you know, creating that common vision together is going to be very important. That's kind of the very first step. What is it? What are the particular things that are wonderful about our area that we can use as marketing tools, if you will, assets that we say, this is why you should locate in our region, Mr. Business. This is why you should expand in our region, Mr. Business. You know, and so getting that common vision clear is going to be important, as well as leveraging the resources that you have and aligning the goals that you have. But all of this happens when you start basing it in data. You need to understand who is in your region and how is it that you're going to use that data to then drive this vision that you have. Okay, next slide. Okay, so when the legislation came out in in July, on the same day, a report was provided by Vice President Biden to President Obama, who 6 months prior, last year's State of the Union address, he charged Vice President Biden, President Obama charged Vice President Biden with figuring out what is needed in our country to make the workforce system work better. And so they came, you know, Vice President Biden had 180 days to come up with a report, and that was much of that was the basis of the new legislation. This report, called Ready to Work, Job-Driven Training and American Opportunity Job Checklist, or Job-Driven Checklist, I would recommend that you Google it and find it online if you have not read it already, because this is critical information. This is kind of going behind the words of the legislation and pulling out some of the details of where the administration is really trying to get this to move to. And that's where you're going to find the information about these SEDS plans and about the state WIB plans, and, you know, a lot of things that are kind of mentioned in the legislation, but they're not giving you a lot of detail in the legislation. Okay, next slide. So I've broken it down. I actually changed the order of it a little bit from what the job-driven checklist is if you look it up, just so that I could come up with an acronym for you to try to remember these 7 points. And the best that I could come up with is s'mores. Now, we all love s'mores. I don't know, most of us love s'mores, graham cracker and marshmallow and chocolate. And so it's just a visual for you to try to remember, you know, what these words are, to try to remember what the important 7 points are that they're trying to keep in your mind. And so those 7 points, as you'll see, are engaging employers, smart choices, measurement matters, opening doors, regional partnerships, earn and learn, and stepping stones. And we're going to go through each one of these individually and talk about them just a little bit. Okay, next slide. Oh, there you go. Okay, so we talked about, we have talked about engaging employers. You know, it's not enough to have each organization in the community going out and talking to the employers separately. You've got probably multiple colleges that are going out and asking employers, with regard to their customized training programs, what is it that we can do for you? How can we help you? What are the new cutting edge technologies in your industry that we can help to train people on? you know, and then you have the workforce system that's going out to talk about tax credits and, the kinds of workers that they can help to provide to them. And then you have economic development that's going out and talking to employers about, do they need room to expand? What are the business opportunities in the region? How can they help them? With infrastructure issues and those kinds of things. We have way too many people going out asking employers all of these. Many of them are overlapping questions. And so one of the things that I would highly recommend is what's called a CRM, a customer resource management tool that has been used in business for many, many years. It seems to be new to the public system, but this is a great tool for engaging employers and then having one database really where you can go back and all share information about these employers. And you can have various levels of access. So I've heard people say, well, we can't use a CRM because economic development finds out proprietary things that they're not allowed to share with other organizations. You know what? That's okay, because there are different levels of access in these CRMs. So you can say, okay, only the economic development people in our region will be able to know this, this field and this field, but everybody will understand that, it might have when the employer was last engaged. So if the employer, if somebody from economic development just went out and talked with that employer last week, you may not want to go out and talk to them this week. You're bugging the person, they're trying to run a business. So, just how often they've been engaged is important. You may want to fill that database up with all of the employers in your region that have 10 or more employees or 25 or more employees or however you want to do it, and make sure that all of the employers are getting engaged, because oftentimes employers who are active with their chambers of commerce or with their workforce investment board, or if they're on the board of the economic development organization, they're the ones who are getting multiple points of attention, where there are other employers who are falling through the cracks and nobody's ever even heard of them and they don't know anything about what you do. So this is a way to kind of organize in the community what's going on. Okay, next slide. Smart choices. What's important about smart choices is that when we send people out into the community for, getting jobs, they need to understand what programs are providing success, and, sort of report cards about, what the data with regard to what jobs provide higher incomes in the region. A lot of this is available on pretty complicated websites that are provided through the Department of Labor, and if it's local data for your region, there are probably ways for you to simplify that information and provide specific job characteristics and skill requirements and career opportunities in the region. What the potential job growth is are those jobs growing in your region? That's all, really important information for job seekers that should be made available on a local basis and easy to access. Okay, next slide. So the next one is measurement matters, and this is really, again, with regard to an idea of a consumer report card. So here are the opportunities that are available. Here's the training that's needed. And then, well, how well are these training programs doing? And if I were to go into this training program, would it really increase my salary? And how do I know, based on other consumers who have gone through that training program, what was their success rate? And again, this is going to apply to more than just proprietary training programs. This is going to apply to colleges as well. So important stuff. Next slide. We have, for many years as the workforce system, done a fantastic job. Fantastic job. This is probably one of the things that we do the best, is opening doors for people who are having a struggle finding their way into the workforce, helping them to break down whatever barriers that they may have in front of them, again, with transportation, childcare, lack of skills, not able to speak the language properly, lots of this is what the workforce system is really known for and what we do really well. But we need to be able to continue doing that, keep that ball in the air, keep doing that really well while we're now adding on all of these other things that the system now is going to demand of us. Next slide. Another thing that this legislation is requiring is that we not only look at our own local region, region being our own local area, that our Workforce Investment Board might cover, but that we look more broadly, that we think in terms of regional partnerships, that we think in terms of, what is the WIB next door doing? What is, how can we work together, even across state lines? We're going to talk about some best practices in the next webinar. One of them is a Workforce Investment Board that has literally crossed state lines and is working on in both states. And these are the kinds of innovative thinking that we need to do, because frankly employers don't stop at a state line, and neither do job seekers. They're willing to cross state lines in order to get employment. Oftentimes it's a free bridge, or it's not even a bridge that is the state line between states, that you can just kind of hop over the line and there you are in another state. And too often the programs and the policies and the things we're working on stop at the state line, and that just doesn't make any sense for employers or job seekers. And they certainly don't make sense to stop at county lines or whatever political boundaries there may be. We need to think in terms of, how should we be organizing that is more appropriate for the needs of employers and job seekers, not what's convenient to our politicians or our public administrators or funding streams, etc. Next slide. Another one of these important entities or important progressive programs that's going to be part of the new legislation is that they want more work-based learning programs. I know as a Workforce Investment Board director in the past, on-the-job training dollars were limited. We typically only had very limited number of on-the-job training contracts that we had money to support. There were very, very shallow connections with apprenticeship, and these are the kinds of programs that are being found to be most successful. When you ask an employer what it is that they want from an applicant, Peter Capelli from Wharton is a professor at Wharton and has done a great deal of research on this. He wrote a book a couple of years ago, and he's been in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, and Narita did a webinar with him last December, and it was, his whole premise is that, he researched what employers are saying is missing. And his book is called Why Good People Can't Get Jobs. And the reality is that there are a lot of people who have fantastic skills. What it is that they're missing is experience. Experience specifically in what the employer is looking for. They may have experience, but not necessarily the exact experience that the employer is looking for. And frankly, the only way to get the exact experience that an employer is looking for is to have a job with that employer, right? I mean, that's the most perfect way of getting experience with them. So how do you do that? these are some of the opportunities that might be available for the employer to actually teach this person while they're engaged specifically in their business, learning exactly the way that the employer wants them to learn. So it may be an internship situation, it may be an apprenticeship situation, it may be an on-the-job training situation, but giving them on-the-ground experience in that place of business is critical and one of the best practices that we are trying to emulate across the country, that we've seen successful in some areas, but not everyone has embraced this as as part of their workforce investment board activities. Okay, next slide. Another part of the legislation that we're going to be looking at is creating career pathways and making sure that we are able to move so we call articulation agreements. That is, if there are courses, for instance, at a community college, does someone have to start all over again with some of those courses in order to go on to a four-year degree? Or if they move from one community college to another community college, it might even be in the same state, are those courses going to be shared, that you're going to say, okay, well, we see that you already have taken those courses and we're going to accept that as part of the understanding that you already have that information under your belt. So articulation agreements are important with regard to creating these kind of stepping stones from moving forward in your career, but also creating career pathways that are clear. Career pathway, it used to be called career ladders, and we thought of it in a linear way, that it was like moving from the basement jobs up to high-level jobs. And being realistic, that's just not how careers go. They kind of wind around, like sidewind a lot. Sometimes you're taking a step, 2 steps forward and 1 step back, or sometimes 2 steps forward and 3 steps back. And it's kind of oftentimes careers go side to side slightly as you're trying to move forward. So what's important is that we help people understand what these transferable skills are that they're picking up, and how they might be able to utilize those skills moving forward into their next career step. And so this is what we call career pathways, and so it's logical and sequential progress in an individual's career. Okay, next slide. So again, this is the eSMORES, if you want to use that acronym to try to remember. I find it helpful. So next slide. What's important is that you need to understand and embrace that economic development has recognized that workforce development is the #1 reason that businesses choose to locate or expand in a region. And that surpasses the low cost of business, it surpasses transportation, it surpasses tax incentives they may be offered, surpasses quality of life, all of these really important issues that they're considering when they're doing their site selection for their businesses. But the #1 reason is for the quality of the workforce. And so we really need to embrace that, and while we have been in a role, workforce development has been on a role of providing program support for people who had barriers to employment, we need to embrace the new role that we're being asked to take on as leaders in the community, helping to determine goals and align these goals with economic development, understanding that we have the most valuable part of the economy. Next slide. And just, if you don't believe me, I wanted to kind of just share this with you briefly. I think this is kind of cool. The UN and Cambridge University kind of came together and did a research paper about what is the workforce worth. And the workforce is recognized as being made up of 3 things: natural resources, improvements, and to those, so that would be like buildings and roads and bridges and those kinds of things. And then the third part of that is a human capital. And if you look at this, you'll see that if you think of just natural resources and the improvements made to natural resources, the United States is worth about $58 trillion. If you add human capital, our value goes up to $118 trillion. So very clearly, this helps you to understand kind of with raw numbers that the workforce is clearly the most valuable asset to the country. And so you have every right to be at that table and helping to make the plans for your region. You have the most valuable resource that you're working with. Next slide. So understanding the difference between economic and work development and workforce development is important. We need to recognize that economic development has a different role than workforce development, but that doesn't mean that there are not synergies that can be developed working between the two. So you have the implementation of business development and quality of life policies that influence growth and restructuring of a region to improve its overall economic well-being. That's economic development, okay? That's pretty clear. Workforce development clearly is about working with the workforce, coordination of skills development initiatives that prepare people for current and future occupations, giving businesses the human capital necessary to meet demand. I think these are pretty good definitions that help to clarify what each of these entities are. And although they have different roles, as I said, they do definitely have synergies. Next slide. So if you look at, again, we're going to look at the differences just a little bit, and then we'll go forward with what the synergies are. But economic development is about creating jobs. Workforce development is more about helping people to get into positions that are already created. Economic development is a very competitive process, region to region. They're trying to draw employers to their region for the tax base, and so they're putting out incentives. They're wooing them, trying to do anything they can to lure business to their region. Where workforce development is funded by a federal entity, so it's much more collaborative in the way that we do things. We don't think of ourselves as being competitive. Now, I want you to think about that just for a second. Both of those are worthwhile ways of seeing the world. We probably should learn a little bit from each other in that. Economic development could learn to be a little bit more collaborative in that it needs to think in terms of regionalization more than just their own specific town or county that they're working for. They probably need, if they would think in terms of a broader reach and what's good for the region, that would be beneficial to them. So they need to think probably more collaboratively than they do. At the same time, workforce development could learn a little bit from economic development in that you are competing. You are absolutely competing for companies to be locating in your region. And, in that way, you need to realize that you have the most important asset is the workforce. What are the characteristics of your workforce that you can market, that you can say, this, Mr. Business, is why you should locate in our area based on these characteristics of our workforce? You have to kind of twist your brain just a little bit and think of it in terms of a marketing opportunity for your region. You're not just a social services program helping people get jobs. You are part of the region's economic development effort to draw businesses to the region and to help to expand the growth of businesses that are already in the region. So I'm not going to go through all of these. I encourage you to come back to this webinar and kind of go through each of these and understand sort of some of the differences between the two. But I think that you will really grasp and begin to understand very clearly that there are differences, but that we can learn from one another. Next slide. This was in the last webinar that we did. as well, and we got a lot of emails from people asking for this slide in particular. So, you know, you certainly can download this. We're happy to send you out this slide specifically, and I also can send you where I got this from. The National League of Cities and the International Economic Development Council created a paper called The Role of Local Elected Officials in Economic Development, 10 Things You Should Know. And so this is not exactly what they wrote. I kind of borrowed the idea, though, and helped to kind of transform it into how economic development and workforce development might sit down and start a conversation. And, you know, when I talked about that economic developers take your WIB director to lunch day, this is the kind of document that you might want to bring with you to start a conversation together, to say, you know, what are our goals, what are our mutual goals, and how can we align those mutual goals with one another? You know, what are the economic development and workforce development strengths and weaknesses in our region? You know, what is our place in the broader regional economy? And anyway, I'm not going to go through down and read each one of these to you, but these are the kinds of conversations that need to be taking place. And it really is economic development director and workforce investment board director. Now, you may have multiple economic development directors in a particular area. It can be very confusing because not all of these regions align perfectly. And so, next slide. So, nobody said that this was going to be easy, right? There are 3,033 counties nationally, 285 cities with more than 100,000 people. There are 380 economic development regions. There are 568 WIB regions at last count. These things change, so these may be slightly inaccurate, but they're about right. So, you know, it's not a simple, you know, it's already been done for you and aligned with you. And you know, there's a guy on LinkedIn who I like a great deal. His name's Mike Lawrence, and he was a WIB director in Pennsylvania, and he also has done some work with the National Association of Workforce Boards. And one of his things that he always says is, if it was easy, it would have already been done. And, you know, I love that because that's the truth. You know, I mean, nobody said this is going to be easy, but it still needs to be done. So we have to figure out, how do we get that done? And as administrators in your region, you've got to just figure this out. And if you need help, there's nothing wrong with calling in a consultant. Sometimes outside eyes are the place to start, so that they can kind of take the, you know, the higher level approach of looking at it from, you know, like 20,000 feet in the air, and then, you know, kind of leave you with, these are the suggestions that we have for how you might move forward strategically, and then you can take it from there. So nothing wrong with asking for help, but, you know, as I said, nobody said this was going to be easy, but that doesn't mean it doesn't get done. Next slide. Okay, so again, you know, some of the reasons it's not going to be easy beyond the political boundary stuff is, you know, the business, business reasons for existing may be in direct opposition with environmental issues, might be in direct opposition with quality of life issues in the region. You know, it's hard to forecast what's going to happen. That's not an exact science. You know, there are maybe conflicting priorities with regard to, you know, whether to buy American or whether we should be dealing with, you know, expanding to other countries, bringing in foreign workers. You know, these are all really complicated issues. This is not easy stuff. And again, you have to look at what's the benefit for your region. How can you come together with like minds between the employers, between education, you know, and really economic development and workforce development are sort of the centerpiece. They're sort of the linchpin of helping to coordinate and align all of these ideas and helping to determine what the goals are that they need to align for their region. Next slide. So, you know, again, we want to talk about not just why it's going to be hard, but what is it that we can do? What, you know, how is it that we can bring workforce development and economic development together? Well, you know, clearly there needs to be probably more career awareness with regard to employment opportunities in the region, in our educational systems. We hear all the time that you know, areas have brain drain, that they, you know, they have a great K through 12 system, and the first thing the kids want to do when they get out of high school is they want to leave the area. You know, and part of that is, you know, that they're not seeing a potential life for themselves there. They may not see what the opportunities are in that region for them. So this is not just about skilling up adults. This is about teaching young people to embrace their culture, to embrace the region that they're raised in, to recognize that they have a future in that region if they want one, and to help them to find that. It's also about, you know, career planning that is lifetime commitment. You know, we're really good about telling other people, oh, you should go back to school, or you should embrace lifelong learning, and then, you know, like, kind of look in the mirror. When was the last time you took a course? When was the last time you you know, invested in yourself in lifelong learning? It's, you know, we can't just do as we say, not as we do. We all have to embrace lifelong learning. So the lifelong preparation and training for businesses in the region, we need to think about retaining businesses in the region. You know, we don't want to just wait until a business tells us that they're closing and then hurry up and do a rapid response. That's not good enough. You know, you should be able to be close enough to those businesses to see the writing on the wall years, frankly, before that business is closing. You should be engaged in conversations with them and helping them so that they are, you know, growing and expanding and invested in the region and feel like they're a valued partner in the region and not just, you know, taken for granted. There should be succession planning, of course, with those businesses. Just because somebody retires, that doesn't mean that the business is going to close. So look at how many people in the community are dependent on that business. Again, recognizing that the business is an asset in the region, and how do you as a community come together to align your goals to support those businesses. You know, some of that means that, you know, it's not working maybe with individual businesses, but recognizing what the industry sectors are in the area and how we can do collaborative training across sectors and across clusters, and help people to find the transferable skills that they may have to move from one company to another that might be still in the same region. Again, mutual goal setting, mutual marketing of the region, working together on grants to bring funds, you know, to do pilot programs, et cetera, for the region, the SEDS planning that we talked about, providing support for entrepreneurs, even providing, you know, like community volunteering initiatives. If a business is giving their employees time off to go out and do community volunteering, that's an important asset that needs to be valued in the region, and you need to do some PR around that, so that, you know, the business is seen as more than just a place to go to work. They're a partner in the community, and that needs to be appreciated. Next slide. So Camoin Associates has recognized, you know, we are truly one of the first, if not the first, economic development organization that has really embraced the new legislation even before it's put into law, and recognizing that economic development and workforce development are going to have to work together. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be really challenging. And how is it that we can move forward and help you to do that? So what's important is that we have learned which are the right partners to be at the table. Frankly, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act does reduce the size of workforce investment boards, but there's still a lot of people on those boards. And, you know, the more people you have, as they say, more cooks in the kitchen spoils the soup. You know, it can be very hard to do planning when you have so many people with so many ideas and so many agendas all fighting to get what it is that they think needs to be done. And what Camoin has begun to really kind of embrace and help regions to understand is who are the parties that need to be at the table first. And then you begin to build out from that, you know, and grow and bring on more people as the ideas are formulated. You also need a research partner. You need to base this data in strong data and in good research, because, you know, it's one thing to say these are our goals. It's quite another to say these are our goals because we know X, Y, and Z. Once you base it in strong data, then you have a good basis for setting goals. Now you can say, okay, we're going to do this. These are the people we're bringing to the table. We've researched this and we understand this is where we are. We're going to now set these goals, and we're going to create measurable objectives based on those goals, so that we're actually moving forward to an action plan and not just talking about what would be great. It would be, hey, it'd be great to be able to do this and this and this. I've seen so many strategic plans from both workforce investment boards and economic development that are just talking air, and they wind up sitting on a shelf and gathering dust, and the reason is they're not action-oriented plans. They don't have measurable objectives in them. They don't really help you to move off of talking about it to getting it done. And frankly, talking about it is just not enough. I mean, you have to move to the action. And once you move to the action, you have to evaluate whether or not you're being successful. You know, those action steps, just as the new legislation was written in order to address the weaknesses of the old legislation, any time you put something into practice, there are going to need to be tweaks, there are going to need to be changes, and you need to be flexible enough to recognize that nothing is perfection. You know, every action plan you put into place needs to be evaluated for what worked, what didn't work, how can we change it, how can we tweak it, how can we make it better, and move forward. That takes you to the next step forward. And so Camoin can help your organizations to do this if you'd like an outside entity, kind of fresh eyes to look at what you're working on. Next slide. So that's the webinar for today. We went just a little bit over, so we do still have about almost 20 minutes to answer questions for you. If you have any questions, please feel free.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Colleen. If anyone has any questions, please type them into the question box, and I'll convey them to Colleen. So I just received a question about the slides, and I've actually received several about this. We will be posting the slides on the Camoin Associates blog, as well as uploading the recording of the webinar to our YouTube page. So you can see the link to our blog on this page, and we will also send that information out to everyone who registered for the webinar. So stay on the lookout for an email from Camoin Associates with a link to all of this information. Okay, so we just got another question about the acronym CRM.
Sure.
Colleen, you can expand on that?
Yeah, a CRM is a customer resource management tool. And if you Google CRM, you'll find that there are lots and lots of them in the marketplace. Actually, there is one that has recently been developed that is specific for workforce development. So that's kind of exciting and interesting. But there are lots of CRMs out there. As I said, customer resource management tools were typically used at first anyway with big businesses who had multiple salespeople out in the marketplace, and they didn't want their salespeople stepping on each other or going out and seeing the same business or saying whatever, basically it was a way for them to organize how it is that they go out into the field and engage with business, and then come back and put that information in some sort of a shared database so that everybody on the sales team understood who was engaging that business, what was said, and that way if somebody quit or died or decided that was promoted or whatever the situation was, somebody else could come back and pick up from where they left off and understand where the links were with that business. So this is just smart to do that in the public system, as we're all have multiple engagements with business. We really should be sharing that information in one database.
Okay, great. And then the next question from Ronald King is, Colleen, do you know of any WIB regions that have a strategic plan in place that meets the 2016 requirements?
Not yet, because we don't know what those are. The reality is we don't even have the rules and regulations for this yet. So there have been a number of WIB regions that have started sending out RFPs, RFQs to help get strategic planning assistance. They're smart, they're progressive, they're recognizing that they're going to need help getting this done because there's a lot of parts of this. But they're probably a little bit premature because we probably should know what the rules and regs are before we try to develop planning for it. But that being said, not a bad idea to start thinking about planning if you wanted to do planning now, and then kind of say, okay, and then when the rules and regs come out, we will go back to this plan and take another look at it and see how we can implement those. So, I wish I could tell you, yes, there's a plan that you can use as a template, and here's a great example, but just doesn't exist.
Okay, great. And the next question is, can you share any examples of workforce development and economic development organizations that are aligning their priorities and collaborating successfully?
Wow, that sounded like a plant. That's our next webinar. Who asked that question? That was a great question.
That was from Sarah Miller.
Okay, Sarah, fantastic question. Thank you for that. And we really did not plant that question, I promise. But that's fantastic. We are actually gathering information from across the country of best practices. And again, there's not any one region that's doing everything right. Okay, that's kind of the point, that there are pockets of across the country where there are some areas that are doing some things good, and but they're falling down in other areas. So the new legislation is asking us to do it all. It's going to be a huge task, and no, I can't really point to one area and say, wow, they're doing everything right. But we will be able to tell you about some great pockets of success and point out some of the really cool programs and initiatives that are being done. If you know of some, I would invite you to write to us and let us know, because certainly I don't know, there are almost 600 workforce investment boards across the country. I don't know every single one of you. I know a lot, but we certainly would love to see what your thoughts are on some of the best practices in the country. So, if you're doing something in particular that is exciting and different, please let us know about it, because we may highlight you in our next webinar.
Okay, and then we had a question requesting that you summarize the major differences between WIA and WIOA.
Well, one of them is that the WIOA is supposed to be funded at a higher level. That's critical. They can ask for all of this to be done, but unless they provide us with the funding to do it, it just can't get done. And so, again, we'll see. you know, and that's up to Congress. We'll see if that's going to actually come to pass. To my mind, the most important thing between the two is that the Workforce Investment Act was really kind of in some ways an extension of the Job Training Partnership Act in that it attended to the programmatic issues of addressing the needs of job seekers and especially job seekers who had barriers to employment. The Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act is very, very different in that it's looking at repositioning workforce investment boards to be leaders in their community and to recognize that they need to be helping to align the goals of their community with regard to the economic development success potential for their region. You know, another thing would be, of course, the idea of regionalization, looking at the broader area as opposed to just the political boundaries of your WIB region. So, you know, I mean, there are a number of differences. We went through quite a few of those, you know, in this webinar. But I think that those are kind of some of the major things that I would say that jump out to me. Obviously, the higher levels of accountability and transparency are going to be critical. You know, making sure that people understand that there are going to be these scorecards of some sort to say whether a training program is working or not. That's going to be great consumer information that's going to be critical in helping people make smart decisions about how they spend their own personal limited funds and also the limited government funds, frankly, for the individual training accounts, et cetera, that are made available to them. We don't want to waste, you know, there's not enough money to waste. We just can't be in a position of wasting any money or time, and time is money. So when people go into a training program, they're not just investing their, you know, in some cases their own personal dollars to get that skill. They're also investing time, which is money as well for them. And we need to respect that and make sure that they're getting out of that, you know, that training program is accountable for what the advance is that the person will get from doing that training. So I think these are all really important progressions with this new legislation.
Okay, great. And then we have a question from Rosie in Maine. She's asking if you can give advice around sharing data, including where to get it, who to partner with to get it, and how to share it with your partners.
Wow. Okay. The data is from multiple sources. I would say the most critical data is what employers tell you. You know, so you can look at, you know, certainly there's labor market information that's provided by your State Department of Labor. There are organizations such as the Economic Modeling. What does SI stand for, Ian? EMSI.
Right, Economic Modeling Scientists International, I believe.
Okay, thank you. I was a little lost with that. I know them as MC. Anyway, they're one organization that Camoin Associates works with that is fantastic at providing information. I mean, there's Burning Glass, there's Wanted Analytics, there are lots of different organizations out there that provide data. But, you know, data is only as good as the person who is interpreting what that data means for their region. And the best information that you can get, frankly, is what an employer tells you that they need. So, you know, you know, yes, it's important to get labor market information. Yes, it's important to understand not only your local area, but your region, your state, and also the country. But it's really critical to understand clearly what employers are saying that they want and getting education to provide, education being trainers, you know, can be your academic organizations, whatever, but making sure that what employers say they need is being provided. So if an employer says we need this skill, you know, the academic or the training organization can say, well, we don't really provide that, but we can give you this. Well, that's not good enough, you know? I mean, the employer's being very clear, no, we need this. And if you're not paying attention and you don't get that lined up, the employer may say, you know what, we're going to go somewhere where they are going to give us this. So, you know, that's, I would really, really clearly suggest that you figure out how to use a customer resource management tool. And again, Camoin Associates can be very helpful with you in setting up something like that, and aligning the data that you are gathering from employers and making sure that you're providing what it is the employers want.
Great. And I'm not sure if Colleen mentioned this, but many states also have their own data resources at their Department of Labor that can be helpful as a good starting point. And some colleges also provide demographic information for free. So those are two options as well to get you started.
Yeah, we had mentioned
I know in New York it's Cornell. They offer a lot of demographic information, which is helpful. But I'm sure there are others throughout the country.
Ian's been doing a lot of research for us. Yeah, no, I was saying you've been doing a lot of research for us. I did mention labor market information from the state Department of Labor, but that's true also of colleges and universities. Community colleges often do their own strategic planning based on research that they've done, and being academics, they tend to be more digital sometimes, and so we can there are a number of resources. Start asking in your community who is doing strategic plans based on data, and start looking at those before before trying to reinvent the wheel.
Great. Okay, and then we have a question about whether the WIOA legislation provides funding to address transportation-related needs associated with workforce. So transportation issues, overcoming transportation issues that are preventing people from getting to work, or getting to the best jobs that they could get.
Does the legislation provide specifically transportation funding? To my knowledge, it's not, there's not like a direct line there item, for that. Again, the rules and regs are not out, but it's probably not likely, but this is the kind of thing, transportation issues typically, that's the kind of thing that you work with your economic development organization on, and or you might work with your local employers on. I can tell you that I've seen regions that have, for example, an industrial park that they put in a location that was fantastic for the industrial park. It was like, inexpensive land, and it was, like a lot of land that was, a great transportation route for trucking and those kinds of things, but it was like way away from the major populations, and so the employers actually at that industrial park got together with the workforce system and created like a bus service to bring people in, for the different shifts, different shift work in that industrial park. So there are lots of creative ideas for how to develop transportation dollars, transportation funding for your region. There are also other, other federal and/or state resources that can become available. It also can be part of your SEDS planning if you're doing one of these comprehensive economic development strategy plans in your region. If you recognize that transportation is a major issue for your region, that can be part of the funding that you request, as part of your strategy. So, what's great is and again, I sound like I'm trying really hard to sell Camoin services here. There are, lots of organizations who do this, but it's great when you have a consultant that comes in and they know already about a lot of these pots of money. They sort of, they've been through this a number of times, and they can sort of guide you as to, where potential funding sources would be, if that's really the case. In many cases, the situation will resolve itself, as I said, like for that industrial park issue, with the employers who are in the region who need those workers. So I would recommend that you look to who the employers are that are having trouble getting workers to their facilities, and start with the conversation with them.
Great. Does anyone have any other questions for Colleen? While we have a quick break from questions, I do want to point out I misspoke. It's Economic Modeling Specialists is what MZ stands for, not scientists, as I said. So
Okay.
I apologize for that. But
we use them. We use them all the time, right? So it's but we always just call them MC. So.
Yeah. So any other questions for Colleen regarding this webinar? And once again, the contact information on this slide, feel free to reach out to Colleen or anyone on our staff if you have any questions about this webinar. If you want to make suggestions to Colleen about some best practices she could cover in her next webinar, I'm sure she would love to hear about those. So you can see her email. You can tweet at her at narita.org. And then Camoin Associates is also tweeting at Camoin Associate. Our website and blog is also on this slide. We will send out an email with links to all the resources about this webinar, past webinars, and then the final webinar in this series about workforce development best practices. So hopefully a lot of you can join us for that as well. It looks like there aren't any other questions coming in, so I'm going to assume everyone had a chance to ask their questions. Once again, feel free to reach out to us if you think of anything else. And thank you all for your time today. We really appreciate it and hope you can join us on March 5th for our final webinar.
Thanks.
Anything else, Colleen?
No, that's it. Thank you so much. This has been fun. The questions were fantastic, and if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to us. That's what we're here for.
Okay, great. Everyone have a great afternoon. Thank you again.